Hi BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. The book we're discussing today is, I'm pretty sure, out of print. In other words, it has died. It haunts the internet in second-hand versions, which can be obtained cheaply in the UK and the US from what I've seen. Hopefully, this review will help you decide whether this is a book you would take the trouble to seek out. Today we are reviewing Dying, in other words, by Maggie Gee, published in the year 1981, 280 pages long. Very short novel, and as you can see by the Amazon prices, Kindle, don't be silly, it's not out there. Print, you can still get some newer copies from Amazon. There are lots of secondhand ones, though. You don't need to pay full price. Cheapest I found in the UK was £2.51, and that included delivery. This book, it's one of my winning titles, as you can see, 15 of 18, and I was trying very hard to move through these titles because I want to finish that TBR list by the end of 2025. So I took it on holiday with me, right? Because it was short. And because of the back cover had a fabulous write-up. It said, Moira Penny, Mo to her friends, vivacious, pretty and young, is found dead, lying naked on the pavement outside her lodgings. Was it suicide or murder? Did she fall from her balcony or was she pushed? Dumbfounded by the mass of papers she left by her typewriter, the police and tabloid newspaper reporter Les Hawtrey soon discover that the further they search for an answer, the greater the mystery becomes. Behind the elegant facade of the Oxford boarding house lie sinister clues, but locked in their own secret worlds of delusion, her fellow tenants and neighbours can shed no light on the events leading up to Mo's death. Meanwhile, the ghostly sound of someone tapping away at a typewriter can still be heard coming from Mo's room. Wow. So I thought this is going to be one doozer of a murder mystery with gothic overtones, and I thought, yeah, I'm up for that. Let's have that. I want to tell you now, the cover write-up is misleading, okay? Just going to say that right now. There is a murder. There are several murders, and they are mysterious. But you'll see how I have described the book in this slide. Experimental meta-narrative fiction. Okay. Postmodern, everyone. So just bear that in mind. This is not going to be the book you expect. It is trying to play with the whole idea of narrative. What is it really? And why do we put so much trust in it when it quite clearly is unreliable as a thing? The structure of the text it varies. The author is experimenting with different structures. They're not sticking to any conventions of genre fiction. And the language and the syntax, that's also unusual in places. Think of writers like James Joyce or William Faulkner. If you love the way they play with language and narration and time and space, then yeah, you might be really fascinated to read this book. Let's meet the author briefly. Maggie Gee, born in 1948 in Poole in Dorset, that's down on the south coast of England. She went to Somerville College, Oxford. She studied English literature, got her MA in English Lit, and then she got another master's degree in surrealism, and then her PhD in the self-conscious novel From Sterne to Vonnegut. So already this is painting a picture of someone who was very academically deep into postmodern literature. And her very first novel was this one, Dying, in other words, in 1981. Her latest work, The Red Children, in 2022, I'm told it's slightly different. And Maggie is currently Professor of Creative Writing at Bath Spa University. So let's talk about structure in this strangely structured novel. We're warned right away. The author's note at the beginning of the book says, this is not quite a novel. No, it is not. In fact, the novel portion, if you like, it is only 161 pages of the whole book. Pages 7 to 196 in my paperback, they're like a novel, but not quite. That's the best you can say about them. And on page 197, there's a new section that begins, which is just called The Papers. It contains some poems, a short memoir, that's one, and the memoir seems to have been written by one of the characters in the previous novel-like thing. And then there's also a few allegorical writings of different kinds. All this may or may not be the work of the young woman Moira, the protagonist of the novel, who's found dead at the very start. So she doesn't have a role, and yet maybe she does. Everything's very open to question, including whether people are truly alive or dead in that sense. But this strange structure calls into question all the assumptions that we bring to a novel when we open it up, when we expect certain things, the beginning, the middle, the end, the characters to be introduced, to be alive or dead, and to act as if they are alive or dead, etc. We can never be sure when you're reading Dying, in other words, whether you should suspend disbelief, and accept the fiction as being true, or whether you should be questioning what it is that you're actually doing while you're reading the book. Regarding the setting, the first section, the novel section, if you will, we'll call it that in air quotes, is set in Oxford, probably in Parktown, and you see the link in my description box, which will give you a map. Because the characters, they live inside a 4-story terraced property of buildings that make a crescent shape, 2 crescent shapes across the road from each other, like brackets opening and closing, which is a metaphor that runs through the text. No other aspect of Oxford is described. So the city itself, it's not really a feature in the novel. We're probably in Oxford because the main character, Moira, is a student, But we don't really know much about their student life because, of course, as I say, they begin the novel dead, whatever that means. So most of the action happens in interior spaces. Time is even more difficult to assess in this novel than space. The narrative isn't linear. It shifts all over the place, back and forth, from one character to another. A mental image came to me while I was reading, in fact. The death of Moira is both the opening event of the novel and remains at its center throughout. Other characters, the people who rent rooms in the same boarding house that she does, her landlady, her married lover, the milkman. The narrative, if this makes sense, it feels like we keep threading a needle that extends out to meet the other characters and then loops back to the event of Moira's death, and then loops in to grab another character or another scene, and then loops back to the central event. And so if you can imagine like a round, a piece of crocheting where you've got the center bit and then everything is building and building and building around it, but it all is hooked together around that center. That gives you a rough idea of how we move about in time. And you can get a sense of this moving back to the center because the novel will often repeat whole passages verbatim, 2 or 3 sentences, and you'll immediately recognize them and think, oh, I read that 2 or 3 chapters ago. And it keeps coming back and coming back to these repeated themes. And so you always feel as though the narrative is something being stitched together around a center, or I don't know, mind mapping notes where you have, your topic in the center and all these little bubbles radiating out, but everything comes back to that center. That's, if you can imagine a novel in that shape, that is the shape of Dying, in other words. Regarding narrative point of view, for the novel portion, it is third-person omniscient. It's all over the place. There's a lot of time spent focused within the mind of a particular character, so you get their dialect and habits of speaking, and then you'll shift, and you'll be able to tell by the change in the habits of speaking that you're with a different character. That's for the novel portion. Toward the back, in the paper section, there are some memoir-like writings that are in the first person. And they're attributable to one of the minor characters. There are altogether about 25 characters in the novel section, all living, as far as I could tell, and all within walking distance of Moira's boarding house or within the building. There's a lot of interiorness to this. It's very sort of close, almost a bit claustrophobic in a way. And again, it just shows how closely tight-knit it is around Moira and her death, suggesting to me all the time I began to feel that we weren't really in a novel with characters. We were in Moira's imagination, where she'd imagined herself as dead and then imagined what all the other characters, how they would react to her death. And that, I think, is the reason why you continue to hear typing noises in her room, because this novel is about being dead but not being dead, dead in other words. And that's how meta-narrative it is. That's how surreal it is. Representation-wise, the characters are about half male, half female. I couldn't identify any non-English, non-white characters as such. Most of the people there are in their 40s or older. Problematic content. Well, as befits Gothic and crime fiction, I think you got to be prepared for some darkness. There is murder, accidental death, rape and reimagined rape, misogynistic, racist, homophobic sentiments throughout, because I believe we're dated back in the late 70s, early 80s. The nature of the prose, as I've already said, is going to be problematic unless you're up for a challenging read. Let's give you a sample from the text, because you're going to see there are places where the narration is easy to follow and places where, like Faulkner, you can be unsure on first reading exactly what is being described. You get a vague idea, but each word you may not specifically understand. I'm reading now from pages 94 and 95 of the novel. And he wouldn't have known, even then, if he hadn't had one of his rare, long nights of insomnia, thinking of swimming and waterproof eyelash dye and where he would go in the summer, and really how good that his job meant that he had a real summer, and whether he'd managed to bear with the boredom of college meetings for very much longer. There were doubts confided in her. And yet, although someone like Moira might giggle and mock, they had to go on. That terrible moment when the treasurer, outvoted on the library project, resigned from the committee, and as he stood up, he knocked over his glass and it broke as it fell, and he openly wept, his pink face in glittering fragments. Not done. The high room, curtained and silent, shut off and discreet, and after he left, Harry whispered, "Old Stokes is a broken man," and he nodded back wisely, urbanely, committed to wisdom and boredom forever by smiling and sitting, shut off from his shock and his pity, his hand very calm on his glass on the dark teak table, the thin smoke waving, saying goodbye to the sun for very much longer, forever. There were forms, there was work to be done, and besides all that, and he curled up his toes, in some ways the job and tradition and form were fun. Swimming in waterproof eyelash dye blue, which was fit to be cried in, and where he would go in the blue skies in summer. Stokes fell from the tree he was pruning and died in the garden peacefully. 2 months later, a stroke, quite peacefully, the lens of his glasses broken, the bright blue skies leaking in, and the summer, the trunk of the great dark tree stretching up in the last blurred shot to the library committee above him, then climbing, straining, fell back, and time flew, and the summer came round again, and his quick, drowsy thoughts flew round, and a black shadow fell on the trunk of a tree, stretching upwards. That's pretty much what you're going to get a lot of in the novel section. Then toward the back, in the paper section, there were some interesting political allegorical writings that reminded me a bit of Orwell's Animal Farm or Huxley's Brave New World or the film Metropolis by Fritz Lang. They had that kind of feel. They were dystopian views of corporate work and the military, and I did enjoy some of the imagery. I did find those quite interesting reading. I don't know enough about poetic form to say much about the poems that were in the back of the novel. I kind of made myself get through those. For our rabbit hole, I thought it might help if we understood Maggie Gee's intentions a bit better. So I'm reading from an interview that she gave, an interesting publication, the Studia Neophilologica. Yeah, in 1997. So bear with, but I think it's important to hear what she says about her own writing. She says, "When I wrote Dying, in other words, I was very, very eager to do something new. and I had been working on surrealism in England. Of course, we learned about her degree. She says, I was 25 when I wrote that book, and I suppose you have more of an exhibitionist streak at that age. I had such fun with the playfulness. As I got older, I realized that being categorized as experimental, though it gets you review space, is death. Also that you can frighten a lot of readers off. Yeah. And she says, I've become more and more aware of the dreadful chasm. To me, it's a tragic chasm between so-called high culture and popular culture. I do want to write stories that matter for people to read. And I think it's interesting, though, that she talks about dying, in other words, being self-consciously experimental and strange. And she says also, I suppose when I was 25, I had less to write about, and therefore the tricks were more important. Now there are a lot of things I want to deal with in my writing that seem as important as the technique or as the tricks of technique. I still try and do things with structure, but they are less self-evident. So that's interesting. I also thought it was interesting that she saw it as a tragic chasm between high culture and popular culture. And I thought, chasm. And I thought, what is this chasm? I suppose it's money, really, at the end of the day, is that chasm. It's a chasm of money. Most readers can learn to read books for entertainment value, can't they? To read any popular book for entertainment value. But to enjoy other aspects of other kinds of books, you do need to learn something. If anything, you need to learn history and where the literature fits in, what period it comes from. But also, as Maggie Gee shows, you need some extensive education in the different kinds of narrative forms and what their characteristics are. And also, you need to get some practice reading those forms with somebody to guide you so you don't feel completely overwhelmed by them. Now, the internet, I'm really glad, has made some of that knowledge more accessible. Now, of course, you still have to be able to afford books and sometimes subscriptions to take online courses. So, there's still, I think, a certain gap there that's made up of money. That is, if money were no object, and of course, if money's no object, then usually time isn't either. If you had all the money and time, you could learn all this stuff and you could read more difficult books. So I suppose what she's not addressing is what's really behind the chasm. It isn't that people sit around going, I don't want to learn anything more about books. I think it's that they know that if they do want to learn more, if they do want to tackle more difficult books, there's going to be this investment of time and money. And depending on where you are in your life, you may not have a lot of either of those things to spare, or other things need that time and that money more. So to sum up for me, I found it, yes, a very challenging read, but I was amused as I was reading it. I could see, even with, I would say, my limited knowledge. I mean, the Open University didn't take us very far into 20th century literature. It kind of introduced us quietly and said, there, I think that's enough now. So they obviously didn't want to get heavy. Maybe if I'd have gone on and done a master's, which I wasn't really interested in, we could have, focused in more on some of the stuff that Maggie obviously got in her degree. Nevertheless, the playfulness it was helpful in a way. It did make me think, this funny thing we do when we open a book. Isn't it funny? We suspend our disbelief quite completely so that we'll argue with a book that says that someone is dead, and yet we can still hear them typing in their room. We don't for a minute think, well, since all this is made up, I could be reading what this person is typing right now. They're typing about their own death. They've made up their own death and their own murder. Yeah, because this is an author, this is a fiction. So it took me to new places in my head ever so briefly. I'm sure there's more that I could have learned or gone into, but I still found it an interesting read. It had elements of crime genre fiction. It had elements of the Gothic in there, as kind of a nod to those forms. But I think the publishers, in an attempt perhaps to make the book more saleable, wrote it up on the back as a more conventional Gothic detective fiction story, and that really wasn't the case at all. So I'm giving that out as a warning. If you like experimental fiction, or you would like a short experimental book that does deal with a genre you're familiar with, just so you can go, what does it feel like? Well, Dying, in other words, is a very short book. So some of the larger things like Ulysses and some of Faulkner's works, which are longer and demand more reading time, if you wanted to, Maggie Gee's, I think, is an interesting playful, modern book that you can still get something out of. I still enjoyed it, even though, of course, I had to adjust my expectations dramatically while I was reading. And that's the review done. That full interview with Maggie Gee and something else, another novel that I felt was a good example of meta-narrative fiction that maybe is a little bit easier to read, and that's Ian McGregor's If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things. That was a novel that reminded me very, very much of Dying, in other words, and that it had a central event, except that central event hasn't quite happened, but all the other narratives feed back into it. But it deals with time a little bit differently. And so I would recommend it if you have read or are planning to read Maggie Gee. Ian McGregor's novel might be a little bit easier to deal with. It's experimental, but slightly less so. Maybe it's a bit more like what Maggie says she started to write as she got older, when she realized that those tricks maybe weren't as important as other things. So, now that we're done, it just leaves me to say, I'll see you again, everybody, in a few days' time. Thanks for joining me today. Take care. Bye-bye.